What happens when one of Hollywood's most recognizable and admired stars arrives for what should be a simple promotional interview, only to discover that the host appears determined to challenge him at every turn? Today, we're looking at the dramatic moment when Dwayne Johnson, famously known as The Rock, sat down with Joy Behar for what initially seemed like a relaxed conversation but quickly developed into an intensely uncomfortable television confrontation. The tension built gradually, transforming an ordinary interview into a moment nobody in the studio seemed prepared for. Before the interview even began, the atmosphere inside the View studio was energetic. Dwayne Johnson walked onto the set with his trademark confidence and enormous smile, immediately receiving a loud and enthusiastic response from the audience. He had arrived to promote his latest blockbuster and appeared completely comfortable, expecting to discuss his career, family, upcoming projects, and the experiences behind his newest film. Whoopi Goldberg introduced him warmly as Johnson made his way toward his chair. The audience applauded loudly, several people raised their phones, and the positive reaction filled the studio. Johnson waved before taking his seat and thanked everyone for welcoming him. "It's always great being here with you ladies," he said with his familiar charm. The other hosts appeared equally pleased to have him there. Sunny Hostin, Sarah Haynes and Alyssa Farah Griffin smiled as the conversation got underway. Even Joy Behar initially seemed relaxed, although her expression suggested that she had something more serious planned for the discussion. Whoopi began by asking Johnson about his new movie and the impressive response it had already received. Johnson immediately became enthusiastic, explaining how thankful he was for the support from audiences and how much he enjoyed working with the cast and crew. He spoke about wanting to create something meaningful that families could watch together. His excitement was obvious, and the audience responded positively. Sarah then brought up some of his humorous social media posts from the production. She mentioned a funny video showing Johnson attempting to squeeze into a tiny trailer, which made the actor laugh. "When you're 6'5" and built like a linebacker, even the biggest trailer can feel like a dollhouse," Johnson joked. The room filled with laughter, and the interview continued naturally. Johnson discussed his daughters, his production company, and his approach to selecting projects. He explained that he often looked for stories involving perseverance, family, teamwork, and overcoming difficult circumstances. For several minutes everything appeared completely normal. Johnson was relaxed, funny, and open. The audience seemed to be enjoying every moment, and the atmosphere remained light. Then Joy Behar shifted in her chair. The change was subtle, but the mood inside the studio immediately became more serious. "Dwayne," Joy said, her voice noticeably more direct, "there's something I've wanted to ask you about for quite some time." The Johnson's pleasant expression remained, but his posture changed slightly. Having spent decades dealing with interviews and difficult questions, he seemed to recognize that the conversation was heading in another direction. "Sure, Joy. What's on your mind?" he responded. Joy leaned forward. "I've followed your career for years, and I have to say, I'm concerned about the message you're sending to younger audiences, particularly young men." The other hosts exchanged uncertain looks. The question appeared to be moving into territory that Johnson had not expected. Johnson remained composed. "I'm not sure I understand what message you mean," he said carefully. Joy explained that she believed his public image was centered too heavily around physical strength, toughness, and solving problems through confrontation. She questioned whether that kind of image contributed to what she described as unhealthy expectations surrounding masculinity. The studio became noticeably quieter. Johnson listened without interrupting. His expression grew more serious, although his voice stayed measured. "I think there may be a misunderstanding," he replied. "My entire career has been about encouraging positivity, discipline, hard work, and treating people with respect. I'm not sure where that interpretation comes from." Joy quickly pushed back. She argued that many of his movie characters were powerful figures who defeated opponents through physical force, and suggested that young viewers could interpret those roles as examples to follow. Johnson's smile disappeared slightly. "I think that simplifies the characters I've played," he answered. "A lot of those stories are really about protecting people, standing up for what's right, overcoming challenges and working together." Joy did not appear convinced. "Teamwork?" she responded skeptically. "Come on, Dwayne. You're presenting an image of masculinity that feels outdated, and some people could even consider it dangerous." The tension became impossible to ignore. Sunny appeared uncomfortable, Sarah looked down toward her notes, and Whoopi seemed ready to steer the discussion toward calmer territory. But Joy continued. She moved from Johnson's movie roles to his public image, particularly the persona he presents as a relatable and inspirational figure. She questioned whether that image was genuine given his enormous wealth and celebrity status. "You call yourself a people's champion," Joy said, "but you're worth hundreds of millions of dollars, living an incredibly wealthy lifestyle, while still presenting yourself as someone ordinary working people can relate to. Isn't there something contradictory about that? Johnson's hands, which had previously rested casually on the arms of his chair, tightened slightly. His demeanor remained controlled, but the warmth that had characterized the beginning of the interview had clearly faded. He appeared to be choosing his words carefully, aware that the conversation had shifted from a celebration of his new project into a much more personal examination of his identity, career, and public image. Joy, I grew up in a working-class family. My mother cleaned houses, and my father was a professional wrestler who sometimes wasn't sure where his next paycheck would come from. I have never forgotten where I came from, and I never will. But Joy continued pushing the issue, seemingly unaffected by the tension spreading across the studio. This is now, she insisted. You can't seriously tell me you know what it's like for a single mother working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over her head. Johnson paused before answering. No, you're right, he said quietly. I can't claim to understand that exact experience. But what I can do is use my platform to bring attention to people living through those struggles. I can support organizations helping them, amplify their stories, and remind people that what they're going through matters. His response was measured and sincere, but Joy appeared unconvinced. Oh, here we go with the charity work, she said dismissively. Another public relations move designed to make you look good. That comment changed something in Johnson. The friendly personality was still visible, but beneath it was the determination of someone who had spent years fighting his way through setbacks and building successful careers in multiple industries. He had remained patient throughout the discussion, but his patience was clearly being tested. Joy, he said, his voice carrying a seriousness that immediately captured the room's attention. I'm not sure what has prompted this level of hostility, but I think we need to slow things down. Hostility? Joy responded with a sharp laugh. I'm asking difficult questions. Isn't that what journalists are supposed to do? The other hosts looked increasingly uneasy. The mood had completely changed from the cheerful interview that had begun only minutes earlier. Whoopi finally attempted to step in. Maybe we should move on to something else, she suggested calmly. But Joy refused to let the subject go. No, I think this is important, she replied. Dwayne, you've created this entire brand around being the perfect role model. But don't you think there's something questionable about someone with your size and influence constantly promoting physical strength as a solution to problems? Johnson leaned back slightly. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the cameras operating and the low hum of the studio equipment. When Johnson finally responded, his voice was calm, but his words carried unmistakable firmness. Joy, I've spent my entire career trying to encourage people to become better versions of themselves. I've talked about education, kindness, discipline, hard work, and perseverance. If you interpret those things as promoting violence or toxicity, then I think that says more about how you're viewing the message than what I'm actually saying. Joy's expression changed immediately. Her face reddened, and rather than stepping back, she appeared to take Johnson's response as a direct challenge. So now I'm the problem, she fired back, gesturing emphatically. I'm the one with the wrong perspective. That's rich coming from someone who makes millions playing basically the same tough character again and again. The audience became completely silent. The excitement that had filled the studio earlier was gone. Sarah looked down at the cards in front of her, Sunny stared toward the table, and Whoopi appeared increasingly concerned about where the interview was heading. Johnson remained outwardly composed, but the subtle changes in his expression were becoming easier to notice. His eyes tightened slightly, and his breathing became slower and more deliberate. He seemed to be controlling his emotions rather than allowing them to control him. Joy, I think there's been a misunderstanding, he said. His tone was still controlled, but there was now a noticeable edge beneath his words. I came here today to talk about my work, connect with your audience, and enjoy the conversation. I'm not sure why you've chosen to turn this into something personal. Personal attack, Joy responded, her voice rising. I'm holding you accountable. Someone has to. You walk around presenting yourself as this flawless human being, but what about the time you supported that politician who had controversial positions on women's rights? Johnson's eyebrows drew together. I'm sorry. What exactly are you referring to? I think you know. Joy snapped. You endorsed someone who wanted to roll back reproductive rights, and then when it became politically inconvenient, you tried to distance yourself. Johnson's expression hardened. Joe, I have never endorsed anyone who wanted to harm women's rights. I have 3 daughters, and their future means more to me than almost anything. If you're going to make accusations like that, you need to make sure your facts are accurate. The other hosts were visibly uncomfortable. Whoopi looked deeply concerned, while Sarah subtly shook her head in disbelief at how quickly the conversation had deteriorated. Facts, Joy repeated with a bitter laugh. The fact is that you're another Hollywood hypocrite who says one thing and does another. You talk about authenticity, but you're as manufactured as anyone. Johnson's hands tightened around the armrests. His knuckles appeared noticeably pale from the pressure. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, yet somehow more commanding. Joy, I'm going to give you one opportunity to take that back. I've shown nothing but respect toward you and everyone on this program, despite the hostility you've directed at me. But if you're going to attack my character and integrity using information that isn't true, then we have a serious problem. Rather than recognizing the warning in his voice, Joy appeared to interpret his restraint as weakness. She leaned toward him, her expression challenging. Oh, what are you going to do? Flex your muscles at me? Prove my point about toxic masculinity? Show everyone that when the big tough guy gets challenged, he turns to intimidation? The studio became almost unnaturally quiet. The audience remained frozen. Even the camera operator seemed to hesitate as the tension reached its peak. Johnson stared at Joy for several long seconds, then his expression changed. The anger was still there, but something deeper had replaced it. Beneath the controlled exterior, there was now visible disappointment and hurt. For a man who had entered the studio expecting a friendly conversation, the exchange had become something far more personal than he had ever anticipated. It wasn't simply anger that appeared on Johnson's face. There was genuine disappointment in the way the interview had unfolded. He looked at Joy for several seconds before speaking, and when he finally did, his voice was barely louder than a whisper, yet somehow every person in the studio could hear him clearly. You know what, Joy? I've been doing this for more than 20 years. I've dealt with critics, people who disliked my movies, and people who believed I wasn't a great actor. That's completely fine. Criticism comes with this business. He paused briefly, collecting his thoughts. When he continued, his voice carried a rawness that hadn't been there earlier. But what you're doing right now isn't criticism. It isn't journalism. This is cruelty. You're sitting here on national television making claims about me, questioning my character, and attempting to tear apart everything I've worked to build. And I have to wonder why. What have I ever done to you? For a moment, Joy's confidence seemed to weaken, but she quickly recovered. I'm doing my job, she insisted. I'm asking the difficult questions that need to be asked. Johnson slowly shook his head. No. Your responsibility is to inform and entertain the people watching. What you're doing is using your platform to spread accusations and hostility. There's a difference. Whoopi finally stepped in, clearly sensing that the situation had gone too far. Maybe we should take a commercial break, she suggested. Joy immediately interrupted. No. I think the audience deserves to see who Dwayne Johnson really is when he doesn't get his way, when somebody challenges the carefully created image he presents. The Johnson looked at her for a long moment. Then he glanced toward the other hosts before looking out at the audience. When he spoke again, his voice had become noticeably softer. You know, Joy, I actually feel sorry for you. I really do. Because what you're doing right now says very little about me and a lot about you. You seem so focused on tearing people down that you've stopped being able to recognize anything positive. Joy scoffed. Oh, please, spare me the psychology lecture. Johnson continued as though he hadn't heard her. I've spent my career trying to lift people up. I've worked with charitable organizations. I've visited children in hospitals. I've tried to use whatever influence I have to make someone's life a little better. And now you're sitting in front of millions of people attempting to destroy that image, because it makes for dramatic television. Maybe you think it makes you look strong. Joy's face had become visibly flushed, although it was difficult to tell whether the emotion came from anger, embarrassment, or both. You're not the saint you pretend to be, Dwayne. Nobody is. I've never said I was a saint, Johnson replied. His voice was becoming firmer. I've made mistakes. I've experienced failures. I've been open about difficult periods in my life and the challenges I've faced. I've talked about my struggles, my relationship with my father, and the things that shaped me. But I've always tried to learn from those experiences and become a better person. Johnson shifted forward in his chair and began to rise slightly. His movement wasn't threatening. Instead, it carried the quiet dignity of someone who had reached the end of his patience. But what you're doing here today isn't about helping me improve or holding me accountable. This is about dragging someone else down so you can feel bigger, and I'm not going to participate in that. Joy immediately seized on his words. So what? You're going to walk away? You can't handle criticism? Johnson looked at her, and there was something almost sympathetic in his expression. Joy, criticism would be saying you didn't like my latest movie. It would be questioning a business decision I made or challenging something I've said publicly. That's fair. What you've been doing for the last 20 minutes is attacking my character using claims that aren't true. Those are two completely different things. If you genuinely can't see the difference, then I feel sorry for you. The other hosts were no longer hiding their discomfort. Sunny looked visibly disturbed by the exchange. Sarah appeared embarrassed, while Whoopi seemed overwhelmed by the situation. The audience had fallen completely silent. The excitement that had greeted Johnson at the beginning of the interview had disappeared, replaced by a heavy sense of unease. You know what the saddest part is? Johnson continued. His voice carried enough weight that everyone instinctively focused on him. You have an enormous platform. You could use it to bring attention to serious problems, help people who genuinely need support, and encourage positive change. Instead, you're choosing to use that platform for this. The Joy opened her mouth as if she intended to respond, but nothing immediately came out. For perhaps the first time during the entire exchange, she appeared uncertain about what to say. Johnson slowly looked around the studio again. His eyes moved across the other hosts, the production crew, and finally the audience. The people who had been cheering only moments earlier were now sitting in complete silence. I think we're done here, he said quietly. Those words carried a finality that everyone immediately understood. The silence stretched across the studio. Johnson reached down and carefully unclipped the microphone from his clothing. The small sound seemed unusually loud in the tense room. Every movement was deliberate, calm, and controlled. He had made his decision. Wait. Whoopi said, her voice suddenly tense. Dwayne, let's take a breath. We can work through this. Johnson turned toward her, and his expression softened. Whoopi, I have nothing but respect for you and this show. But I can't sit here while someone makes false accusations about me and my family in front of millions of people. I simply can't do that. Joy, perhaps realizing that Johnson was genuinely prepared to leave, changed her approach. Oh, come on, Dwayne. Don't be so sensitive. This is how we do things here. We ask tough questions. Johnson slowly turned toward Joy one final time. The anger that might have been expected was absent. Instead, his face showed profound disappointment. Joy, tough questions would be asking me about my business decisions, my movie choices, my political opinions, or my charitable work. Tough questions are grounded in facts. They come from genuine curiosity, concern, or a desire to understand. There's a difference between challenging someone and deliberately trying to tear them apart. What you've done today is make accusations that aren't true, question my character using information you've either misunderstood or completely invented, and try to tear down someone you haven't even taken the time to know. That isn't journalism. That's cruelty for the sake of cruelty. Joy attempted to defend herself, but the confidence in her voice had noticeably weakened. I was only trying to have an honest conversation, she said. No, you weren't, Johnson answered firmly. A genuine conversation requires respect from both people. It means listening as well as speaking. It requires honesty and a willingness to understand the other person. You came into this interview with an agenda to attack me, and every time I responded with facts, you followed up with another accusation. Sarah finally spoke, her expression filled with discomfort. Dwayne, I'm really sorry about this. This isn't what we discussed beforehand. Johnson gave her a reassuring nod. I know, Sarah. This isn't your responsibility, and it isn't on anyone else here. This is between Joy and me. He turned his attention back toward Joy, who now seemed increasingly uncomfortable as she realized that the mood of the entire studio had shifted. Joy, I want you to understand something. I've been incredibly fortunate in my life. I've accomplished things I once never imagined possible. But I didn't reach this point by tearing other people down. I worked hard, treated people with respect, and tried to help others along the way. I've never needed to destroy somebody else in order to build myself up. Joy looked down at her notes, fidgeting with the papers in front of her. I was doing my job. Johnson's response was quiet. If this is your job, then maybe you need to find a different one. A noticeable gasp came from the audience. Johnson hadn't shouted. He hadn't insulted her. The statement was delivered with such calm certainty that it carried more impact than an angry outburst could have. Sunny attempted to bring the conversation back under control. Dwayne, is there anything we can do to continue this discussion in a more productive way? Johnson looked toward her appreciatively. Sunny, I respect you and the work you do, but I think the damage has already been done. I can't continue talking with someone who has already decided I'm guilty of things I never did. He stood up completely. His imposing presence filled the space, but there was nothing aggressive about his posture. Instead, he looked exhausted, as though he had just endured a conflict that never needed to happen. You know what bothers me most about this? Johnson said, looking directly at Joy. It isn't only that you attacked me. It's that you did it in front of an audience that includes young people who look up to both of us. What kind of example are we giving them? What does this teach them about how people should treat one another? Joy opened her mouth, but no response came. For the first time since the interview began, she appeared genuinely speechless. I've always believed that public figures have a responsibility, Johnson continued. When millions of people are watching, We have an opportunity to show them how disagreements can be handled with maturity. We can demonstrate how to have difficult conversations without losing respect for each other. We can disagree while still treating one another with basic dignity. He paused before continuing. You failed at that responsibility today, Joy. And that isn't just disappointing for me. It's disappointing for everyone watching. Whoopi made one final effort to repair the situation. Dwayne, please, let's start over. Let's have the conversation our audience came here to see. Johnson smiled at Whoopi, but there was sadness behind it. Whoopi, I would love nothing more than to sit here and talk about my movies, my family, my upcoming projects, and everything your audience actually came to hear about. But I can't do that while sitting beside someone who has spent the last 30 minutes trying to damage my reputation with accusations that aren't true. He began moving toward the edge of the stage. The production staff immediately appeared nervous. The cameras continued recording, and the audience watched in disbelief as one of the biggest stars in entertainment prepared to leave a live television interview. This is ridiculous, Joy called after him. Her voice now contained a hint of desperation. You're being far too sensitive about this. Johnson stopped. He turned around one final time. Joy, he said clearly, his voice carrying across the entire studio, sensitivity isn't weakness. Caring about your reputation, protecting your family's honor, and standing up for the truth aren't character flaws. Those are parts of being human. If you view those qualities as weaknesses, then that tells me everything I need to know. He paused near the edge of the stage and looked toward the audience. To everyone who came here today expecting something different, I'm truly sorry. You deserved better than this. You came here expecting to have some fun, hear about upcoming movies and enjoy yourselves. Instead, you witnessed someone attempting to tear another person down for the sake of entertainment. The audience began applauding. At first, the response was hesitant and scattered. Then the applause grew louder until it filled the studio. Johnson continued speaking over the reaction. I've always tried to be someone people can look up to, someone who shows that dreams can become reality through hard work, persistence, and treating people the right way. I hope what you've seen today doesn't change that. Sometimes standing up for yourself means knowing when to walk away from something toxic, even when leaving is difficult. Joy made one final attempt to regain control. Fine, then leave. Run away like the overgrown child you are. Johnson looked at her with an expression that seemed more disappointed than angry. Joy, I'm not running away. I'm choosing not to participate in an attempt to destroy another person for entertainment. Those are completely different things. And someday I hope you understand the difference. With that, Johnson walked away from the stage as the audience erupted into thunderous applause. The cameras followed him as he greeted members of the production crew and embraced his publicists, who had hurried over from backstage. Even after everything that had happened, he remained composed and respectful as he exited. Back on the set, the remaining hosts sat in stunned silence. Whoopi looked deeply embarrassed. Sarah shook her head in disbelief, while Sunny appeared visibly emotional. Joy remained seated, seemingly unable to process how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. Well, Whoopi finally said, her voice tense, I guess we'll be right back after this commercial break. As the cameras cut away, the seriousness of the moment began to settle over the studio. What had started as a routine promotional appearance had transformed into an unforgettable confrontation. Johnson had walked away from the interview, but his calm response, refusal to engage in further hostility, and decision to leave with dignity had left a powerful impression on everyone who witnessed the exchange. The audience watched closely as Johnson prepared to respond, while the atmosphere inside the studio became increasingly tense.